There was a new street in my neighborhood last night. It was dark by now. My eyes had adjusted enough to help me move from one pool of street light to another. Last night, like most nights after dinner, I like to take a walk around my neighborhood, if time permits, listening to songs or occasionally podcasts on my phone. I was lost in my thoughts when suddenly I came to and realized I was standing in front of a street sign. It said, Zarelith. As far as I remembered, I never stepped off the sidewalk, and yet seeing asphalt beneath my feet meant I must be standing on said street. Which was strange too, considering I had been walking down Summit, which is uninterrupted from Coal to Tin. I looked down the northern end of the street and saw the sign for Coal, and I turned south and saw the sign for Tin. The houses on either side of the road looked like the ones I was remembered seeing here, but I just never recalled seeing a street between them. I looked down the street and it looked unremarkable, perhaps disarmingly so. It snaked around, and before it went out of sight around its own curve, it could have easily been any other stretch of street in my neighborhood. Though truth be told, I'm about as curious as I am oblivious, so embarrassingly it wouldn't be impossible for this to have been there the whole time, but now regardless I was conceding to my curiosity. So I started walking. The road went on beyond the curve and continued to wind lazily away. Never a side street and never ending, far, far longer than any residential street I've ever seen. Nothing immediately stood out as being particularly unusual. The houses all varied in their style and shapes, but overall nothing specific seemed particularly out of place. This was true for about a mile. It was about at this point that the houses were starting to feel strange to me. I couldn't really place it as anything specific. Maybe sometimes a door felt slightly too big, a window off-centered, or the dimensions of the walls were unusual. It would only take about another half mile before I could voice exactly the individual things wrong. One was a door that didn't meet the ground. It was nearly a full foot from the walkway that led to it. Then I saw a house where there was no door at all, only some windows. I decided to take a look. This would be the first time I would have left the road. But I walked up to the window and looked inside. I could barely see anything at all. But really, I shouldn't have been able to see as much as I could. In the corner of the room, I realized there was a dim flickering bulb. Barely had any strength at all, but was casting just the slightest amount of light into the room, enough to display its contents. The room otherwise seemed to have furniture, but it was strange, and I couldn't figure out how you were supposed to use them. If they were meant to be sat on or hold things or act as storage. Each seemed just slightly impractical for any one of those purposes. I took out my phone and held it up to take a picture. My phone flashed as it took the photo. It was so bright and so sudden that it made me feel immediately uneasy. As if up until this point, I had been able to visit silently, but now had announced myself so stupidly to the world, to this world. I put my phone away and quickly returned to the road. I kept walking. The houses kept getting stranger. Windows became slanted, doors too thin to walk through. Sounds seemed to echo from inside some of them. I decided not to investigate these. The road kept going, and I kept following it. Only now seeing the rule break had I realized the rule at all. Until this point, the roads and yards had been spotless, no trash caught from the wind or junk left out front. While I love my neighborhood, it's not unusual for a derelict car or something more mundane as a broken flower pot or old rusty yard equipment to be found out front. There had been none of this, until now. As the strangeness of the houses began to increase, so too did it seem the trash increased. Specifically, the trash I was seeing seemed to be mostly dirty pieces of fabric, strewn about, mostly on the roads but some appearing in the yard. I assumed this was probably the type of trash fallen out of trash cans until I tripped on something. It was a shoe, a small shoe. It was about time for me to leave, I decided. But an element of my curiosity was still demanding an answer. And as it was, my courage had returned enough after being dulled by the window incident. I needed to know what it was like inside a house before I left. I decided to find a house, specifically one of the ones without noise coming from it. I looked around and saw a house that most of its peculiarity was in the fact it was around 4 stories tall, with each floor having a vastly different shape than the ones above or below it, looking like a stack of jigsaw pieces. But for my needs, the bottom floor had many windows, and most importantly, a door I could fit through. Silently, methodically, I paced toward the house, unaware that as my foot left the road, I began holding my breath. Through the windows, I could see the inside well enough to make out the cavernous quality of the interior, empty with the exception of a couple sparse pieces of furniture strewn about or protruding from walls. This was a good sign, I decided. I don't have to go anywhere out of sight, just a quick step in, then out. As this thought finished speaking itself, I startled as I realized I was at the door already. While my nerves were quickly changing, there was no reason to abandon the plan that hadn't existed when I made it. So I reached out. My hand landed on the odd, irregular knob. I gave it a slight turn and felt the tension of the door leave as it was ready to swing open for me. I took a deep breath and pulled it back a few inches. I hesitated and my hands began to shake. Okay, fine, I thought. Just open the door, look from here, or if I'm feeling especially daring, stick a foot inside, and that can technically slam. Before I could finish the thought, the door pulled hard against me, and the knob flew out of my hand. The door slammed shut. Click, the bolt on a lock slid shut. It was time to go home. I spun and shot back toward the road. Desperate to return to the road, I didn't even realize in my terror until I nearly reached it that it wasn't vacant anymore. Hello, neighbor, he took a drag from his cigarette. Blew out at me. I froze. Standing in the road was a man, dressed in a black suit, white collared shirt, black tie, and by all measurements looked extremely normal. His face was clean-shaven, dark hair slicked back. The first giveaway that he was not the same normal as me was his eyes. They didn't seem to point accurately. They weren't quite aimed at me, but I was positive his full attention was on me. There also just seemed like too much white in his eyes. Then he smiled. Normally, I do it all at once, but he seemed to choose to do it one muscle at a time. First one side, then the other. Finally, as he lifted to smoke again, his arm moved aggressively and jittered to bring his hand to his lips. Now, I was sure we didn't have the same bones. I'm almost ashamed to admit that it wasn't, until he poorly mimed taking a drag by moving his hand to his lips, then doing nothing with his mouth, that I realized what was in his hand wasn't a cigarette at all, but a finger. A small human finger. I turned and ran, and ran and ran and ran. The back of my throat ached and my legs felt rubbery, and I wanted to quit until "Hello, neighbor" rang out behind me. Far too close, louder than before, and coming from higher than before. Like I was being spoken down to. I didn't look back, fearing if I did I may trip or just freeze in fear. I ran and ran until I saw the cross street and the Zarelith sign that had led me here in the first place. I let whatever energy I had left carry me over, and the moment I crossed onto Summit, I collapsed and fell rolling into the road. A moment later, I got back to my feet to see what may have followed me, but instead saw the two houses that had previously flanked Zarelith, adjacent to each other with only space enough for a thin walkway to a backyard between them. It was again how I had remembered it before. I've never again seen the street, nor can I find any record of it existing anymore. Before I fully doubted my sanity, I remembered to check my phone and my pictures. The picture of the window does exist, though of course that proves nothing to anyone as far as evidence for the truth of my story, as you can barely even tell it was supposed to be a window of a house. All you can really see is me awkwardly trying to take the photo, and even that is blurred. But even with the blur, you can vaguely make out behind me the outline of a man apparently having a smoke.